Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Author Talks, which will feature Mrs. Louise Mathurin-Serieux, the author of On the Shoulders of Peasants. It is one of the first books that has specialized in looking at the economic history of Saint Lucia and the contribution of peasants in Saint Lucia's national development. My name is Raisa Joseph, and it's my pleasure to host this discussion with you, history students of the South Louis Community College, to be able to share with you the wonderful work done by this author, and to also gain a greater appreciation as to how does it connect to your work, whether you've done HIS 113, a survey of Saint Lucian history or heritage, or as Cape history students, how does this work pertain to Saint Lucia, to give a deeper dive. We've done a number of topics looking at the economic history and development of Saint Lucia, and we have an opportunity now to hear from an author who's actually written in that particular area. So I want you to give her a round of applause for being here with us today. I want to encourage you to be as vocal as possible, to ask questions, not just about the book, but about the journey and understanding history. It's your opportunity to understand a bit better, a bit more about Saint Lucia, about research, about history, and all that is involved within it. Before we actually get into discussing our author, I would like to allow our librarian, Mrs. Kathy Butch-McDiarmid, to give an introduction to the author.
Thank you very much, Raisa, and warm welcome to students, guests, and our faculty. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's edition of Author Talks. Author Talks is a program that was launched by the library about 2 years ago to bring authors into our space at the South Louis Community College to connect with students in the different fields of expertise, okay? So it is hosted this week as part of our National Library Week activities here at the Hunter J. Passoir Library. Today we are especially pleased to welcome Saint Lucian historian and author, Mrs. Louise Mathurin-Serieux. Mrs. Serieux owns a research company named Nouvelle Strategies Limited, and fun fact, she's also the mom of 2 girls, 2 of which are in our audience with us this morning. Many of you may already be familiar with her work, On the Shoulders of Peasants. How many of you have heard of the book? Show of hands. 1 at the back? Okay, that's good enough. So On the Shoulders of Peasants provides and offers a powerful and thought-provoking exploration of the role of peasantry in shaping Saint Lucia's agricultural and economic history. So Mrs. Serieux has spent extensive time on the research to compile this book. It is my hope that the talks today will help bring your learning and your ideas to life. As students and faculty, you engage with textbooks in the classroom and with the notes that your lecturers provide. But today you have the opportunity to engage directly with the mind behind some of the work. This is where learning deepens through dialogue, questioning, and reflection. So we want to urge you to ask your questions to Mrs. Serieux and the lecturers present here this afternoon. Don't be shy. Louise's work, as I said, is grounded in research, but it also speaks to identity, resilience, and the importance of understanding your own stories, the stories of our ancestors, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, and so on, and how they contributed to the economic development of our country. Please join me once again in warmly welcoming Louise Mathurin-Serieux.
Yes. So welcome, Louise, once again. Before we go into the book, we need to find out more about you. And my first question for you is, can you tell us about your experience with history as a student in Saint Lucia? What was your experience like, your teachers, and the things that you learned at school?
My very earliest experience with history, well, first of all, good afternoon, everyone.
Good
It's
afternoon.
really an honor to be here. Students, and thank you, Ms. Joseph and Mrs. Birchmark Diamond for welcoming me, and all of the staff really of the library and Saint Louis Community College. I wanted to say that given how much I'm passionate about libraries and love history in itself, I feel like it's really an honor to be here. It's like an intersection of things that I love. My earlier experiences with history from my own readings would have been something that sparked my interest, but in terms of from an academic space, it at first was kind of disconnected and lacking, in that we had these situations where the persons teaching us were not necessarily historians or persons interested in history. They would have been, person may have been doing it out of obligation, so they would write a blackboard full of notes and walk out, and everybody would just write the notes and be like, why do we need to know about the boats, the names of the ship that Columbus had, But, I think back now and I see it. There was a point where I had really passionate teachers, Mrs. Hetty-Meyer, and I'm sure you know about her. And I would have met these history teachers who would have sparked that interest in me because of their own interest and passion and enthusiasm around the subject. And I think they would have had a great impact in keeping that flame alive in me in terms of that interest and that passion I have for history. Or maybe making it more focused than it would have been. It would have maybe fizzled out by now. And so by the time I got to A-level, my history teacher, Mrs. Hetty-Meyer, introduced me to capitalism and slavery, because I was the only student doing both economics and history. And she saw that book, and that book, if you have a chance, I always say, read it. If you can't find it, it should be in the library, of course. Read that book because it's one of the most sterling examples of an economic history of the Caribbean. And it really helps you to have an understanding of our economic history and why things are as they are today. And it gives you the global context as well. Yeah.
You mentioned that you studied economics and history. A lot of times students are discouraged from pursuing history because they don't see it as a path for their professional development or aiding them in any particular way. How did an understanding of history help you to study economics so that we can allow our students to see history as a support system to the fields they themselves are pursuing?
Yes. One of my favorite quotes from Sir Arthur, at Saint Louis Community College and Saint Louis himself, so I can't remember the exact quote, I have it written somewhere, but it's something to the effect that the downfall of our nations would come with economists who do not know their history. And so no matter what field you are in, you have to be able to understand the context, the history of that space. It will make you better in whatever field it is, not just economics. And I felt like from the standpoint of an economic historian, understanding the history helped me to assess the economic state from a broader lens and understand that there's something wider happening in terms of the global context and the way things have been structured over time that help to explain what is currently happening in our economy. And therefore, the solutions themselves need to have more depth. Yes. So,
appreciate that. Okay. So what was the aha or epiphany moment that said, I need to write a book on the shoulders of peasants in Saint Lucia?
It was a few years after I wrote my thesis, I realized that I would be constantly contacted to share the thesis. And on an occasion, persons would have said to me, why don't you write a book? If it's in the library, people could just access it. And I don't know if I could mention the person who came to my home while they were doing their MPhil research to get a copy of my thesis. So it was just not accessible. Maybe I should say, a bit more about the thesis now. So it was a thesis on economic diversification in Saint Lucia, 1897 to 1945. And what it really sought to do was to look at, we hear a lot about the sugar industry. I'm sure as history students, you have learned a lot about the sugar industry. And I wanted to learn more about the economy because our economy was not just the sugar industry. And so as I learned, I became more interested. I was like, the lime industry? I didn't know we had a lime industry. The rise and fall of the lime industry. the rise and fall of the cocoa industry, specifically in Saint Lucia. I looked at the rise and the fall of the coconut industry and how regional trade, it was an example of how regional trade helps our economies. And so I was looking at them, I was learning from them, and I was understanding that there's so much to history that we have not yet even explored, far less published. And so there was also the beginnings of the banana industry. I don't think you all are too young to not know about the banana industry, but you all may not have known that as far back as the 1920s, we would have already explored the banana industry, and we would have had the industry rise and fall twice before we had what we had in the 1950s, and that went into the 80s and 90s, that period of green gold. And so we had these periods where we could have learned lessons from them, because the very same patterns that happened in the first industry in the 20s happened in the second industry in the 30s, and it happened again in the 80s, and it was actually predicted by a development economist, Beckford. He predicted it in the 1960s, but we did not pay attention, and that speaks to us undervaluing history in the field. In all other fields, we undervalue the importance of history, and we suffer for it. Yeah.
Having listened to some of your previous public discussions about not just looking at Saint Lucian history and the industries, you place a particular focus on the Saint Lucian person. So what story did you want to tell about Saint Lucians in the development of Saint Lucia?
Yes, so that was how my book differed from my thesis. So while the thesis was this much younger person digging through a lot of statistics and getting excited about the data, what the data was saying, and teaching us about our economy, that later stage when I decided to publish the book, there was this consciousness in me that helped me to realize that all of these years of studying history, we were not doing enough. Well, I know as a professional was not doing enough to center ourselves in our story. And if you're not the star of your story becomes very uninteresting and disconnected from you. And that is why some persons think history is boring or history is not. But if you understand that story tells why your life is how it is right now, and that it will build a certain level of consciousness, sometimes pride, and sometimes even resilience within your own life. From understanding that story, everything changes. And so with my book, On the Shoulders of Peasants, it was taking that core of the industries that I learned all of that thing about this rise, the fall, and seeing at the back of it who was making it happen. And they kept mentioning the peasantry in Saint Lucia, the peasant. Maybe I could read a few extracts about it for you in a bit. You want to do it now?
You can.
Okay, so one of the earlier, as early, I just need to make sure I go directly to the correct page, because I don't want to spend too much time searching. So very early in the examination of the work, in terms of exploring the industries, I would have seen quotes that reference the peasantry and how important they were in Saint Lucia's economy. So as early as the 1890s, you would have seen a quote that said, let me say it as follows. So, Daylight newspaper in Saint Lucia, the year is 1898. While the sugar planters are thus positioned, there is another class of workers in our midst, whose cause at present requires our assistance and support. We refer to the peasant proprietors. So that is the term they used. And many of you already know by now that this term is now the technical term used in Caribbean studies for that group of persons. But as far back as the 1880s, I would have seen examples of them being referred to. I don't even know when it started, but it has been used for quite a while. And they continued, it is impossible to overestimate their value as a factor in the agricultural advancement and general well-being of the island, of this class of workers. They are the body of toilers whose labor carry with them the tripartite blessing of wealth, peace, and contentment. And so a lot of things come up in that quote that I saw in the research. For one, they were not supported. And this is what led me to go back and say, okay, I know about all these industries. Let's go and research them coming out of that point of slavery. Slavery has ended. How do they get to the point of becoming these persons described here? How do they acquire land? How do they get persons to live on their plantations? How do they acquire enough wealth for them to actually produce sugar, cocoa, limes, coconuts, and later on become at the forefront of the banana industry? And so that first chapter, if you look at the book, chapter 1 was actually the last chapter to be researched, because I wanted to go back to understand that. And so centering the people became very critical when it became from the thesis. The thesis was that foundation, these export industries. And seeing these persons come up over and over again, I saw the importance of highlighting them and their story. And in that way, I developed an immense sense of pride. And I think anybody who reads that story as a Saint Lucian, when you look at the innovative ways in which they overcame the obstacles that came with being former enslaved persons, owning land and finding ways to actually productively produce that land and then going into the export market, immense sense of pride.
I'm pleased that you mentioned that. And a lot of your work is not just text that you found. You actually went into communities to interview individuals. So tell us about the Saint Lucians you met and the information that they shared with you. What interviews stick out for you and what actually was pulled into the book, having not only read historical information, but gone out then. I think for the students themselves, they've recently completed their own projects. They did research on a variety of areas. Some did dead segment, some did piracy in the Caribbean. Tell them about the experience of going and interviewing Saint Lucians and what stood out for you.
Going out to interview Saint Lucians was a very exciting experience. At first it was not. I'll tell you what. I learned the hard way that if you're not speaking Creole and you're not letting them interview you first, you're not getting any information. You are not getting any information. I would go and I would say, okay, I'm being professional as an MPhil student and as an employee of the University of the West Indies. I came to interview you, blah, 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 and I'm speaking to this 98-year-old, and they would look at me and they would say, Kimon Kimamau. And I'll be like, oh, okay, we're doing it like that. And so it would have to be a case where quite often, the first time I interviewed someone in English, I got like 2 paragraphs of what seemed to be a very rehearsed thing. And the first time I interviewed somebody in Creole, we spoke for 2 hours. And it was a very insightful conversation. And some of these persons are no longer with us, because that was about a good decade ago, I think I did that. And some of them are here. One of them just turned, I think, 104 or something like that. One of them is there. And so what the idea of that process or that part of my work was, because one thing we have to understand as persons in former colonies is that the documents do not really tell the story of the persons, or always tell the story of the person that are working on the ground. A lot of the documents that I went through were all about reporting to Britain what was happening. So the agricultural reports, the blue books, the annual reports on agriculture. I'm trying to think of as many as possible, but nothing is coming. But yes, we would have been able to speak to persons in communities who had that story passed down or would have observed certain things as children, and they were able to help me see things from their perspective so much more. I'll give you an example, the lime industry. If you look at the records, it said the lime industry is thriving, the peasantry are growing limes, they're selling to the lime factories. The government has made a decision to establish a lime factory in the middle of, I think it was in Castries. And then they said, eventually they said the lime factory has closed. No, first they said the lime factory is being fed. A lot of persons are coming and they're bringing their limes and it's going great. We're getting a lot of things to export. And then they said, there's been low exports, there's been low sales, the price of lime has dropped, and we have closed the lime factory and sold out pieces of it. That's one side of things. But when you speak to the persons who know the story of being involved in that industry, they would tell you of the loss and devastation of watching their limes rot on the ground because they would have not been informed that the factories were going to be closed. They would have grown, harvested, and paid to be transported to castries and arrived to closed doors. And so it shows you the kind of burden. When I speak of on the shoulders of peasants, not only do they put the growth of the industry on their shoulders, but they suffer the brunt of the collapse. And so that is.
That's an excellent piece to note, that they support the development of Saint Lucia, but they also take the consequences, the negative sides of development that we don't want to think about.
Yeah.
Having spoken about that, there are two follow-up questions from the point that you raised I want to ask. Do you see similarities between the challenges of the peasants then and farmers in Saint Lucia presently?
Yeah, I once said there's no wall between then and now. It's us and they are us and we are them. And so the terminology is different, but essentially a lot of us, our families own land because of the innovation and the sacrifices that were made by these groups that we call the peasantry. And so they would have started with their kudme in order to ensure that the land is profitably utilized. They would have had susus, they would have had friendly societies, and they would have gotten together in groups to purchase several acres of land. And so in terms of what farmers do in terms of feeding the nation, right now, that is what they did, and as well as contributing to the export sectors, because we were at the time dominated by agriculture. So that root and the value of our farmers right now, that's something also to be noted. Sometimes we undervalue the persons who feed our nations, and we forget that the basis for almost all other industries and commercial prospects within Saint Lucia came from an agricultural place or space. And so we need to see that value and celebrate that contribution of these persons. Yeah.
Wonderful. One of the questions that I normally ask the students, but before I do so, I'm so happy you mentioned language being so important. We normally have discussions about education, people's development, and the ignoring of Koyol, for example, in the education sector, disenfranchising a number of people in Saint Lucia. So the ability to speak Koyol, and connected to that, I wanted to ask you, based on their sharing about themselves, their identity and their culture, and even their role in the industry, how did they see their work transform their communities? Because they're working, yes, but their work didn't stop at just being line producers. It helped to transform what was into what we have now and the communities that they actually live in. Can you tell us about any particular communities where you saw development happen that saw transformation?
Yes, I want to say two things, but I will start with the end part. I saw a case where métayage is that system where they list land to the point of purchase, right? And so eventually, métayers established what you call a métaya association. And so that was one of the ways in which persons would have acquired land. And it was quite interesting to look at it as I did the research, because the persons who own the land were like, okay, our industries are suffering. We're going to allow these métayers to, rent land and do their little thing, and we get a percentage so that we could keep things alive, and, we'll kick them out as soon as things are better. And the métayers were thinking, we're doing this because we're about to own your land. That's our goal. And so there was this difference in how they saw themselves and how they were viewed by society. And so with that in mind, they got together. These métaya associations saw their role as persons who brought about mobility, social mobility. And so they would get together and pay for school for students in the community. They would find community development projects and put together to work on it. And so beyond just being persons who wanted to develop the space on an economic basis, there was this sort of unselfish functioning where they were working collaboratively to better the community as a whole. And so this is why I ended up adding a chapter specifically focused, and it's called The Peasants and Policy. But the goal of that was to show how they were not just economic actors, but they were able to contribute from a social, political standpoint to St. Lucia's economy as well.
You can take this. Go ahead.
Sorry?
I see you going to the chapter, so I'm allowing you to go there to share anything you think that stands out.
So one of the things that caused a complete change in policy, the peasantry, as they were called, would have worked for many decades in terms of improving the economic state of things for various industries. And it got to a point where I would have shown how the United Kingdom would have had issues, economic issues within the colonies earning. And so when they sent in a commission called the 1897 Commission to find answers basically about the state of things and make recommendations for the future of the colonies. And with St. Lucia specifically, because of the way in which the peasant farmers were so productive, their policies for St. Lucia was quite different from, say, Barbados or other countries, where they did something very revolutionary and said, okay, the sugar planters are not making enough money, the peasantry are the ones earning, and they look like who's going to give us money, so let's forget about everything else and try to support the peasantry. And so that was the first, one of the earlier examples of that. I think it also happened in Jamaica, and that was a more popularly known set of recommendations from the 1897 Commission. And one of the things I show in chapter 7 is the ways in which the 1897 recommendations would have, directly impacted policy in St. Lucia at certain points. Of course, there was a lot of cases where better said than done, and the peasantry continued to struggle on their own. But there were a few areas. For example, you spoke about Creole. Mm-hmm. The recommendation was to appoint an agricultural officer, and that person had to be fluent in Creole, conversational in Creole, because their main clientele had to be the peasantry, who at the time in St. Lucia, 70% of persons were Creole-focused speakers. So things like that show you the impact they had from their economic work and trying to do it on their own, that self-determination, that drive, then led persons to follow on a broader policy level.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. I'm going to do something unorthodox based on our program. Since some of our audience have another lecture to go into, I'm going to give them an opportunity to interject at this time to make some comments or reflections based on what they've heard. The floor is open to you. Even though I may not have asked the question that you want to ask the author, this is your opportunity to talk to the author. It's your platform to ask her questions on what she shared so far, on the book, something that has stood out for you. The floor is open to you. So I can pass the mic around? Yes. I'm going to pass the mic to you, so just raise your hand, and I'm going to come across.
Hi, good day.
Good day.
You did mention that upon research, you realized that you had to speak the Creole language more often. Was there any other challenge that you may have faced out there?
In terms of collecting my data collection?
Yeah, that.
Or specific to the interviews?
Any research would be.
Okay. I think one of my initial challenges was finding documents pre-1897 locally and even regionally that helped to provide the kind of insight I wanted. And so through the University of the West Indies, through a program at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, I was able to go to the British Archives. And I spent 2 months in the British Archives, where I was able to access all of St. Lucia's blue books and our social, economic reports, all of the correspondences from like the 1890s in reference to the topic, And that's helped a lot in terms of filling in gaps. So if anyone has, quite often that's something that you anticipate if you're doing in-depth research on a British colony or a former French colony. Unfortunately, a lot of the documents that you will need will not be in the country or in the region. And that's something we need to advocate for us to get our, maybe copies of them or digital versions of them on our soil. Yeah.
So just one more question. Since you did not have access to all of the resources that you may have wanted, how long did you have to research? How long did it take before you felt satisfied with all of the information that you had to turn it into this book right here?
Yes. Okay. Quite interestingly, I could have still been researching today because every time I answer a question, I have a new question. And as soon as I published the book, I was thinking of the next book because there's always more out there, questions and information and data than is in one text. So I started somewhere around 2000, and in terms of the thesis, I would have done my thesis somewhere around 2010 and would have wrapped up around 2012 thereabout in terms of the research part of the documenting of the thesis. And off and on in between from there until about a few months prior to publication. So somewhere around 2023, I would have said, okay, let's, but there would have still been cases where, as I'm wrapping up the book, something would come to my attention. I'll be like, oh, there's a gap here. Let me go and find the data on that 1898 map about Denry and things like that. Until a friend said, and I have to thank the library here for that, she said, why don't you register for the book fair? That way, that never-ending book, you need to wrap it up and, complete your editing and drafting of chapters process and so on. And that's what I used the book fair as a sort of target. And so I was able to publish a few months before the fair so that I could participate in it. So you have to stick to your scope, establish your scope, try your best to stick to it. Things will come up later on when you're done with your data collection process. Fill in the gaps, but then do not turn it into a never-ending. I think you told me something like that once, a never-ending story, because it can become it very easily. Yeah.
Asking from personal experience, because today they did research and I was like, it's a whole documentary. Students, very interesting, and it's difficult for them to say, okay, where do I stop? Because they find more and more information. So I see Ms. Dalla has a question. Be brave, Dalla. There's no wrong way. No, let you ask it. It's coming from you.
Yes, so go right ahead. We support you.
I wanted to ask you, what was the hardest part of writing a book?
It's a beautiful question.
The hardest part for me was organizing my chapters. And I feel like once I had decided that this is how my chapters will be organized, I felt a weight lifted off of me. So yes, I love to do research. I like digging through stuff. I could spend months and years collecting data and documenting things. And then writing, I love writing. But then deciding, how am I going to tell that story? Am I going to start here? Am I going to be chronological? And I don't really like to, I want thematic. So the organizing could be a challenge. And once I had organized the chapters and I was happy with it, I probably reorganized them a few times before so that was the hardest part for me. But once that was done, I was able to focus on just going through them, editing them, making sure they flowed well, making sure all of the evidence was solid. The second hardest part, which I have to special mention to the editing, because it's not, it's time consuming more than anything. It might not be as brain heavy as, organizing the chapters, reading and analyzing things, but it's something that takes a lot of time.
Okay, so what I got from you sharing is that history is a study of cycles and patterns, and it's sort of like a rehearsal for a bigger stage. So I was wondering if you think Saint Lucia at this point in time is ready to maximize and go to its full potential.
Like, economic-wise, or? I think that's a great question in terms of looking at what does this teach us from a broader standpoint. Because one of the things I did is I put out the last chapter of the book, it's the conclusion, and I put it in short points so that persons can start, it sort of trigger your thought pattern. What can we learn from that? And so one of the things that came up was the rise and fall of all of these industries. I saw this one pattern where it was constantly external factors. But we were not publicly stating that it was external factors. For example, the banana industry, when it collapsed in the 30s, we said, oh, it was Panama disease. But then, when I did my research, it was not Panama disease. It was actually there was no market for the good anymore, and there were issues with shipping. So there was a situation called a short shipped, where you had tons and tons of bananas being left on the docks because Saint Lucians continued to produce, but there were not sufficient ships to take them away. And simple things like that were not taught to us and erased from sort of our stories, and people were just saying it's Panama disease, ignoring little aspect. So I think in terms of trying to understand now what we could learn from it, I think we can be the best version of Saint Lucia, as you say, by looking at these patterns, learning from them, and seeing, okay, how do we incorporate that into policy making? Yeah.
Anybody else have a question from Lucia? Did I see you smiling? You want to add something to it? If you like, you can tell me, right? This is your opportunity to ask. You've done the economic development of Saint Lucia. You looked at the struggles and the challenges, independence and movements towards it. You might as well focus.
It's more of a comment and not a question. You mentioned the lime industry where producers would go to sell their limes, but then the door was closed. It just had me thinking, to be honest, because I grew up in the time where the banana industry was sort of booming, and I could remember going on the farm with my dad, and I could just imagine my father working so hard on his plantation, but then when he gets to the docks, there's nobody to sell his bananas to, and I could tell you how hard and how long my father would work on that farm for the day. So, yeah, I could tell how heartbreaking that could be.
Yeah, it is heartbreaking. And I think the only thing worse than what they went through is the fact that their story was never told. Like, I feel like we should understand the kind of sacrifices that were made for us to set that kind of economic foundation for us. Yeah. But let me just add that they were very strategic entrepreneurs as well. And so one of the things I found very impressive was the rate at which they moved to the next thing. And that was a huge part of their survival. So they went to the docks, the limes are down, the limes have rotted, and the next thing you hear, the peasantry are, planting bananas at a large. And it would be very rare for you to find them with areas of land that had one thing. And so one of the persons I interviewed would have said, well, when something collapsed, we would all go pick coconuts and everybody would be selling jelly coconuts. Some of us will even do house-to-house jelly coconuts. And so it was just finding ways, that resilience, that innovation, that's something to be admired, and that's something that is in us. Yeah.
Thank you so much for these comments and questions, students, which have also fed into my new set of inquiries to the author. I know she's smiling. It's not any difficult question I'm going to ask. With the interviews that you did so far, and I know research never ends, you always think about what's next. Having done the interviews and even now with new information, what do you think needs to be shared about the peasantry that you haven't shared before on economic development, having done the research so far and having read more? What is left unsaid in your view?
In terms of unsaid in this interview, or I haven't put it in the book?
Well, this is the first of many books that you will write, I'm sure. You ended it, but were there unanswered questions that you are now going to pursue about them? So having interviewed perhaps the individuals and they may have shared a particular insight that didn't necessarily come in the book but still remains something on your mind. What are these kinds of thoughts that you have, these stories?
There were a lot of them. One of them that I would love to dig deeper into was the details of how they would sustain themselves. And you know, everybody talks about sustainable living and now living off the grid. But when you interviewed persons, they would be like, okay, my husband was a person who made belts out of leather. My neighbor's husband owned goats and he would make the leather with the goat skin or with whatever skin, animal skin, he was a leather maker. And then they would also speak about who would make cheese. There's a person who would make, and so I would randomly just hear about persons. There was a lot more feeding, actually making what they needed to sustain themselves as opposed to purchasing or importing. And it would be interesting to look at the details of that and the extent of it and learn about the methods they use. You know, some of them have remained, of course, farming. A lot of persons still make farming. They spoke about that. They would speak about making the soaps in the factories with the coconut oil, buying 1 cent or half cent soap in. They would go to cut a piece of soap from the factory and sell it or buy it for themselves at home. Just a lot of different things that we no longer do. I would be interested in learning more about how they did it, what they used, how it affected the health even, the fact that they were not as exposed to things like additives and preservatives. So that's one interesting aspect that for me. But more than that, the most interesting for me was the role of women, the women landowners. I would like to delve deeper into that. You know, women who own land and they would have their pot of farming on their head and one child on the left and one child in the arm, and they going up to the farm and they would be productive exporters and farmers and be one of the peasant farmers that's listed in the numbers, but their experiences would have been different from the male peasantry, obviously, in many ways. So I would want to learn more about the women and what were the obstacles they faced? Was it easier or harder for them to access land? And one of the things I recently learned is that 2 of our largest landowners in the early days would have been women, earliest landowners. And so I want to learn more about that story as well. Yeah.
I would have loved if you knew their names, so I say yes.
Yeah, I've been searching.
I want to know their names.
Calling people. I saw it mentioned in a documentary and I've been trying to find, but I have not been able to. Yeah.
As yet,
I will. Mm-hmm. Next book.
Yes. When you did your studies, or the period that you're studying is a Saint Lucia that is not independent as yet. So as you rightfully said, a lot of the work done by Saint Lucians, the peasants at that time, was divorced from a government that was fully interested, not just in the economics or the money aspect of what can I get from them. Having seen their resilience, their work, which I'm sure continues today, and now being an independent country, what more can you see the agricultural industry, those in the green economy, being able to do with the support of government that is now an independent government that should be oriented towards not just the economic returns, but how they transform the society?
Yeah, 2 things I always, after this book, I felt strongly that we should focus more on was, 1, local produce for local consumption, so that's supporting that, and beyond just the primary products, but that's the manufacturing to an extent of what we consume. And the second was regional trade, because I saw that the only industry that survived the fall when the international markets failed us and the shipping failed us was the coconut industry, because we had trade agreements with Barbados and Trinidad. And so even when the war came and nobody was exporting our goods internationally, we continued, the industry continued on the back, basically on the arrangement, with Barbados and Trinidad. So that makes a case for us to strengthen, and I think there's so many possibilities that we have with regards to trading, having regional trade agreements with each other, and it's a way to protect ourselves from, and even now we're seeing the importance of protecting ourselves from global crisis, and so these are the two.
For students reading your book, as impactful as Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery, if a student, like the students in this room, purchased a copy of your book, what are maybe your top 2 or 3 takeaways that you would want them to at least be able to decipher, whether or not they did economics or they have any interest in agriculture? What are some of the key takeaways you would want them to be able to draw from your book?
For one, the first one, and I always say this, is you should feel a sense of pride when you look at our history and the accomplishments of our people, specifically the persons who were called the peasantry. The second thing would be that there is a very strong case, and I speak about it in the prologue, where I speak about definitions and why the term was used and how it's used in Caribbean studies. There's a strong case for us to reconsider the use of that term, and these kind of things take time. Similar in Caribbean studies, we made a shift from using slaves to using enslaved persons. We could make the shift we could start the discourse about how could we make that shift from using peasants and peasantry to refer to that group of persons to a term that's more fitting.
For the students who may not know, why does peasant carry a particular kind of definition? Because somebody might understand why calling somebody a slave might be something bad, but they may not think, well, what's wrong with calling them a peasant? Give them some enlightenment on that particular term.
Yes, I'm trying to figure out if I should just read that section for you. Okay, I will read a section here for you where I speak about the term, okay? So, as it's used in Caribbean studies, the prologue I have, it starts with a quote from Sir Arthur Lewis. And he said that the point at which a peasant ceases to be a peasant is a nice problem. But it is not a problem whose solution is essential for the development of this essay. And this was him at the beginning of one of the beginning paragraphs of an essay, an unpublished essay he wrote about the Caribbean peasantry. And one of the things he highlighted was that globally, when you speak of peasantry, it's quite often persons who are subdued or subservient to another group, who they do not usually own land. They usually have a measure of, I'm forgetting the word, but they have to pay certain dues. Their lives are controlled a lot by, the persons who own that land or have a certain social status according to how things are structured above them. But with the Caribbean peasantry, I'll read here for you how I defined it. And so it's used widely in Caribbean studies to refer to groups of cultivators or entrepreneurs. Does that sound similar to the way the term is globally used? And that is something he pointed to. So Arthur Lewis himself pointed to the fact that the way peasantry is used globally and the way it's used in the Caribbean region, it does not match. But he himself said, we're not going to go into that. We're just going to go and talk about them. But as to why that term was utilized, I go into speaking a bit about the fact that there were peasants who owned acres and acres, hundreds of acres of land. And so when we start to talk about the meaning of peasantry and the origin or why they were being referred to, it's quite often a question of origin, which is questionable in itself. So because I'm a former enslaved person or the descendant of a former enslaved, I will be called a peasantry and I own 200 acres of land, but somebody else will be called a planter. And so
on
that
entrepreneur.
made it
So
a
in
bit
other words,
questionable.
it's not empowerment to say, okay, you look at
Yes.
them from a perspective that they're a rising economic class,
Yes.
the rising middle class. They're not described in a way that reflects the work that they have done.
Yes, and the social, and so in a sense, it grouped them in a place that sought to box them in, regardless of how they advanced in society. And despite that, you would see in the last chapter I spoke about the peasantry would eventually be the ones. And I think it's Professor or Dr. Michael Lewis spoke about that, how they were at the forefront for fighting for the rights such as, political rights, the right to vote, things like that. And so, as much as the term tried to box them in, instead of the term boxing them in, they revolutionized the term. And so the term means something else in Caribbean studies. But globally, it's still a term that is a bit, I don't want to say pejorative. Yeah.
I understand what you mean.
Mm.
I think one of my final questions to you in terms of the book and the quote that you mentioned, we're at the Saint Lucia Community College. And apart from knowing the name Saint Louis, the students don't know much about Saint. How did Saint Louis's work empower your own work? Because you reference him in the book. How does his work, in your view, assist you in your own research?
I think that for starters, his paper on the peasantry, it really helped to make me feel that, my thoughts on the matter felt like he was backing up basically my thoughts on the matter. And so that was the main in terms of his use in his works. I'm trying to think, Sir Louis would have, obviously done a lot of work in terms of assessing Caribbean economies and writing about the state of things. So that would have definitely been something that provided context for the work that I was doing. Yeah. So in many cases, I would have utilized quotes from him or so on in terms of the context, the understanding the context of that plantation economy or that economy that we're working within. Yeah.
My last question before I allow you to share any other point that you think you want to leave a lasting message with the students for is this. In teaching history, at least in terms of my own classroom, I teach history for life, history as a tool. How would you share with students the power that history has given you in your own work as a researcher, as someone who works in the field of economics and other spaces? How can history help in terms of refining our own specialized field of entrepreneurship, whether it's in marketing, to build and to actually assist Saint Lucia in its national development?
Yes, I definitely think that it starts, let's go with consciousness. So whatever field you're in, it's extremely important for you to be grounded, for you to understand your story. I'm not just going to call it history, your story, because that is where you ground yourself. And I will be courageous and say all of the stories I've read of persons who have accomplished great things in their lives would have gone back if they had not started out as persons who knew their history, who understood their heritage, who understood where they came from. They would have had a point in their life where they paused to go back to understand and reconnect with themselves in that way. And so there is this importance in history in terms of building consciousness. But from a technical standpoint, I felt like history really sharpened my skills in terms of analysis of large amounts of information. So I work with both numbers and with themes, so thematic analysis, towards then taking it and framing it into a story. History would have sharpened that skill for me, and I'm able to bring that into a lot of spaces. For example, I would have worked on a project with an organization that deals with weather patterns, and so they would have wanted historical analysis of certain communities that tells a story of what has happened in the past to help them with hazard mapping. And so that would be something that is easier to do because of the years and years of working with large amounts of primary sources and secondary sources, reading all of these books and then pulling it into a story. That's one of the in terms of skill building, history does that for you.
Excellent. I'm going to scan to see if my audience has any questions or comments before I ask this question to you. At this time. Yes.
I just wanted to say that I like how you said not history, but your story. When you said that, a lot of things just went through my mind. So I like how you said that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
While I am the moderator, I always like to allow the guest, our main subject, to also share with us some points that they want us to take away. So what are some key points for us that you would like us to note when we reflect on your book and this moment today?
So for one, I want you to, well, I've already said it, I'll reiterate it. There is a sense of pride that comes from learning this story. And the persons highlighted in the book, sometimes when we look for heroes, we look for specific persons who held a particular office, but we have to understand that some crucial heroes in countries, in nation building, are groups of persons who work together to accomplish something important. And so these are the persons that I believe that we need to learn about as Saint Lucians, and that's one of the things I want you to take from this book. Another thing is question everything, because the stories that I would have been told for almost all of my life would have been turned on their head as I did this research. So things such as I just mentioned, the fall of the banana industry, the reasons for the collapse of almost all of our export industries, the ways in which our relations with international markets disadvantage us and put us in certain positions and have affected how our peasantry or our farmers or exporters suffer at the end of industries. All of these stories, some of them were not told, or some of them were told in certain ways. There's a section in the book where I spoke about an entire policy that came in the 50s, I think, where it was focused on, the proposal was to try to destroy the peasantry. So basically try to scrap as many and go into large land areas, so buy off all of their land. And that was an actual proposal because the persons who were proposing it were ignoring the contribution of the peasantry, and they were trying to convince the Saint Lucian government to actually implement this policy where this is how we would have pursued the banana industry. And can you imagine the impact of that? Many of us, the economic mobility, some of us, our university degrees, everything was funded by the banana farming, of the small banana farming that happened. And so question everything, that's the second thing. And the third thing I would want you to take from that book is, let me be very careful. History is not something that's remote or disconnected from us, but something that we could learn from. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you for that beautiful closing. So the past is present. We can give the author a round of applause. The past is present. I want to thank all of you who are here, who have listened, who have contributed tremendously to this author talks. You're also welcome to talk to the author after this forum. I know some persons like to have one-on-ones, and you have a wonderful opportunity to speak with the author, to get a copy of the book, to ask her any other information, because some of you may very well want to write a book on Saint Lucian history one of these days. I believe it. So we want to just thank you for being present and being able to engage with a Saint Lucian historian who has seen the importance of who we are and has shared the beauty of being Saint Lucian and the contribution made. Now, to formally thank Louise, I want to welcome from the library Mrs. Melissa Emmanuel, Assistant Librarian. Can you put your hands together for her?
Good afternoon, everyone. When I heard I was a history author talks, I was scared because I thought I would be bored, but very informative, very interesting discussion. On behalf of the library, we are deeply honored to have this event included on our National Library Week calendar of activities. Library Week is being formally celebrated from April 19th to 25th this year, and we are especially pleased to host meaningful events such as this as part of our programming. We extend our sincere gratitude to the author, Mrs. Louise Mathurin-Serieux, for sharing your story and your work with us. Your contribution has truly enriched this occasion. Special thanks to Ms. Raisa Joseph, lecturer in history, for her collaboration with the library in bringing this activity to life. We also wish to acknowledge the support of other lecturers in the history department. Mrs. Montrup, thank you so much for being here with your students and for your continued support. To the history students, this event would not have been possible without your presence here today. Thank you. To our visitors, I notice we have a few visitors. Thank you so much for being with us today. Oh, great to have you with us, sir. We are also grateful to our sponsors of National Library Week who have come on board to ensure the success of our activities. They include the South Louis Community College, First National Bank, Bank of Saint Lucia, CIBC Caribbean, Financial Investment and Consultancy Services Limited, FITS, Sonics Logistics Limited, Saint Lucia Hospitality Industry Workers Credit Cooperative, the CEL, Tibbs Tech Solutions, Inc. Our appreciation is also extended to our collaborators at the college, the Marketing and Communications Department, the e-learning unit, and to our library staff for your hard work in preparing this beautiful space. Thank you everyone, including those watching this video, for tuning in, and we look forward to your support throughout our library week. Thank you.
We also have a special presentation to be made to Louise. I'll invite, I believe, the librarian to assist us for our special presentation, a small token of our appreciation for your time and for your support. Students, I have a small token for you, very small too, a little something sweet to make you feel nice. Yes.
On behalf of the South Louis Community College, and as we commemorate National Library Week 2026, this is a token of our appreciation to author and historian, Mrs. Louise Mathurin-Serieux. Thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing.
Thank you very much. It's truly an honor to be here.
You can clap more, you know. Yes. To continue to support your library, to come into the library, to get a copy of Louise's book. She has copies available today. If any of you want a copy, you want to purchase it from her. There are always special student fees, so don't worry about that. You'll be able to afford it. And I have small tokens to make you feel good as you go home. So see me after and continue to support Author Talks. Thank you so much.